The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Welcome to a discussion with editor and teacher Ann Charters. I'm Steve Benson. Ann Charters is the author of The Portable Jack Kerouac, also Jack Kerouac Selected Letters 1940 through 1956. She also teaches at the University of Connecticut. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Steve. It's good to be here.
Well, first of all, going back into both the letters and the writing of Jack Kerouac brought me back to the days of turtleneck sweaters and berets, beards, and coffee and all-night college bull sessions.
That's
it was
right.
Wonderful.
The glorious 50s. When I was young, too, and when I first met Jack Kerouac, actually, 1956. So those are really sort of unbelievably 40 years ago, but I'm glad the books brought you there.
Well, it seems to me that there's been a bit of an eclipse in Jack Kerouac, but there's always been an underground interest in him. And why that lag and why now the renewed interest?
Well, the reason that there haven't been any new Kerouac books for the last 20 years, the last one to be published was his posthumous Visions of Cody. That's the last important Kerouac book. There have been small press books, but these are the major Kerouacs since 1972 because the estate has finally been settled under the administration of John Sampas, and he asked me to do a book of letters as the first book that the estate has authorized. And I said I'd be delighted to do it if I get a chance to do a Kerouac Reader, which is a book that I'd been waiting to do since 1975. And he said, go ahead. So they both come out together.
And the Portable Reader is a pretty hefty volume.
Yes, it joins the Portable series, and it's a book that Jack envisioned being part of a portable Kerouac, like a portable Steinbeck or a portable D.H. Lawrence or a portable Nietzsche, since 1965, when a friend of his, John Cullen Holmes, offered to do one for him.
And of course, Jack Kerouac always thought of himself in that great tradition. The writer, he was comparing himself to Proust and talked about remembrance of things past, although his was, I think, on the run.
That's right. And his books were written as a completely written lifetime. That is, each novel fit as a separate segment into the story of his life. So I arranged or organized the reader to show the larger dimensions. Most people know that he's the author of On the Road or this crazy book, The Dharma Bums, where people have rucksacks and go to climb mountains or have love affairs in Greenwich Village or San Francisco, and books like The Subterraneans. And they don't know that those are just chapters, those books, chapters in this completely written lifetime. And I really wanted to put them in their place, you might say. So I used segments from these most popular books, but began with the earliest book about his childhood, Visions of Gerard, and I ended with one of the last books in the legend, Big Sur, which was written just in 1960.
He also talked about his life work as one vast book.
Yes, he did, and this is another attempt to show it. You can't really get all of Kerouac in this one volume. I mean, the stack of books is almost 20 by now. But you can get an overview. It's a good introduction, I think, and the best introduction to the larger scale of what he was working on.
And of course, in the selected letters, you point out he was not only a prodigious reader, but also a prodigious writer as well.
That's right. The one thing that Jack didn't do in the novels was emphasize the fact that his whole life was lived around the central idea that he was a writer and that he was going to create this completely written lifetime. So I conceived of the two books as companions. And if I was able to show you the real life that he lived in the letters, you would be better able to appreciate the writerly nature of how he turned it into what he called true story novels. So I include, for example, letters, and they will be paralleling a section of, say, Vanity of Dilloaz, one of the books. And I point out in a footnote that if you want to go to Vanity of Dilloaz, you'll see how this section, which is describing his family's move from Lowell, Massachusetts to New Haven, Connecticut, when he was a Columbia student, how he's treated this as a novel in the book that he wrote about this period of his life. So ideally, you'll have 1,200 pages of new Kerouac to absorb if you read the two books together.
Is there a self-conscious element in his letters? that he was writing these letters to be read not only by the person he wrote them to, but by, in quotes, posterity?
I don't know about that. Actually, he didn't think of himself so much as writing as many people do in journals, I think, for another reader. But he was able, almost uncannily, to echo the thoughts and the verbal inflections and the ideas. He was a superb mimic. So if he's writing someone like Ginsberg, you get Ginsberg's prose style. If you get a letter to someone like Gary Snyder, you get Gary Snyder on the page that Kerouac is creating. And of course, he uses this later to good effect when he creates the characters modeled on these true life people. But no, he's not writing it in any kind of grandstanding, stunting way. I don't believe that. But you can get an appreciation of the fact that he read widely, and the fact that he thought of himself as a Franco-American in a different tradition, and not an Anglo tradition, but in a French tradition with Proust.
I was going to say, that was one of the interesting things for me to discover, that really his first language was a French-Canadian dialect,
That's
not
right.
English.
Until he was 6.
Yeah.
He spoke with his family at home Quebecois, which is the French-Canadian dialect that people in Massachusetts spoke. And one of the discoveries for me as a biographer was whether or not his mother had written him in French or in English, since the language at home between them, when I was there as visiting in Hyannis in 1966, working on a bibliography, and met the mother as well as Jack, they spoke French together. And I was fascinated to see that in her letters to him, and I quote some in the book, she wrote in English, broken, immigrants' English. And it seemed to me that this was a reflection of their need to assimilate, that she was trying to become American. She didn't have a thought of going back ever, to Canada. And it was interesting because I have an immigrant grandmother who never learned English properly. And when she wrote her friends and my parents, she wrote in Yiddish rather than English, even though I spoke to her in English all the time. So this was an unusually literary household, I would say, that this woman, Gabrielle Kerouac, wrote her son in English, although at home the language around the table was French.
Do you think also it provided a sense of tension, too, that not quite belonging, and of course the fact that Jack spent so much of his time on the road?
Absolutely. He says this himself in his books, but again, in his effort to write a more universal lifetime, an American lifetime, not a French-American. Remember the times he's living in. I mean, it's such a marvelous time to be alive now in 1990-something, when we're trying to be more conscious of the ethnic diversity that we have in this country. Whereas when Kerouac's growing up, it's the melting pot concept, and you hide your origins if you're trying to be a writer, or at least he felt so. So there wasn't a strong Franco-American community as there was, say, a Jewish community in the literary community of New York. So there was no reason for him to stress his background. And he writes about the fact in his letters that he's felt marginalized because he didn't get the right beginnings speaking English so late in his life. He said as late as his college days, when he was 21, he felt he was a lout when he opened his mouth to talk English. And this is reflected so honestly in the letters. You have a sense of the heritage and the sense of being an outcast, a literary outcast.
These were also incredibly heady days, the end of World War II and that incredible period after the Second World War.
Yes, with the enormous sense of the country growing into an era that it had never known, and a new need for self-definition. What did it mean to be an American, and what was the future for America? And of course the Beats, including Kerouac and his friends William S. Burroughs or Allen Ginsberg, and then Gary Snyder later, and Phil Whalen, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, all the central core of writers who would form the Beat generation, felt themselves estranged, not because they were all French Canadians, but because they wanted an alternate culture, basically. They didn't buy into Perry Como. And
they bought into jazz,
they bought
and I'm
into
ask you later on,
yes.
because bebop and that incredible use of language and scat.
Yes, they were very sensitive to black culture, and especially jazz culture, and they really felt a sympathy for people who were minorities, that were the downtrodden ones, and wanted to create a literature that was a literature of spontaneity, of feeling. And this made it very hard after Kerouac discovered his way of writing spontaneous prose in 1951 to get his books published. He published a first very conventional prose-style novel, The Town and the City, in 1950, and then no books until On the Road in 57, because he insisted on writing what he called spontaneous prose.
Of course, there are many questions, and we were talking about this before we went on the air. What would have happened if he'd survived into the age of word processors?
Oh, he would have been happy as can be, because when he wrote the version of On the Road that we have as the novel, he taped sections of paper, drawing paper together. You can see the manuscript with Scotch tape, now very, very yellow. And he fed it as a 120-foot continuous roll of paper into a standard manual typewriter. And he worked for 3 weeks while his wife fed him pea soup, he said, and coffee. He did that book, he said, on caffeine primarily. And he did it without stopping, because he felt if he had to stop and put a new sheet of paper using 8.5 by 11 sheets into his typewriter, he'd break the flow, he'd break the sense. He wanted to create on the page the way a jazz musician created with a saxophone.
Yeah, an endless jam session.
That's
and of
right.
course he writes about Dr. Sax.
Yes, that's another one. That one was done with paper and pencil. Again, he had to break the flow to turn the pages, but he didn't have a typewriter. He would have if he'd had one.
Why don't you give us an example of some of those wonderful letters?
Okay. I'd like to, let me start actually with an early letter, because it's important to understand that coming from this immigrant culture, being a first-generation American in what was then the early years of World War II, in the early 1940s, when these young men were just getting out of high school and entering college, and then they would be drafted. There was a special group of friends from Lowell High School in Massachusetts who were his classmates. And his best friend was a man called Sebastian Sampis, who, like Jack at the time, believed in a socialist, pure, visionary view of America. And they were idealists, and they called themselves the Prometheans. So the letter I'll start reading, I'll read from it, because they're all very long. This one is actually not by Jack Kerouac, it's to Jack Kerouac by Sebastian Sampis, because it gives a sense of the kind of feeling of idealism and hope to be a writer and interest in culture. And it's also very sad, because this is a letter from March 15th, 1943, written at Camp Lee, Virginia, by, he called him Sammy Sampis, this Greek friend. And Sammy Sampis will be dead within a year. He's killed or badly wounded on the Anzio beachhead and dies shortly afterwards.
And it also concludes with a poem that you use as the front
Right,
piece.
exactly. Jack, you may or may not pardon this letter, but as I am writing it in the black heat of exasperation, you may evaluate it as such. Your letter has caused me no end of annoyance, either to the defense of your ego or mine. I have asked you to look at things logically, and instead you've done just the reverse. They're both 21 years old, by the way. Of course, Prometheanism, that's their socialist organization, hasn't arrived, but at least by working toward the right direction, no harm can come of it. You claim that individuals such as ourselves have forged groups such as ours and have helped mankind, yet you dismiss the whole issue. The great Jack Kerouac dissents, and the whole issue is forgotten. But if you were dissatisfied with the procedure of Prometheanism, why didn't you cry out before? Why wait until now, when all of us will be broken up before long? If our viewpoints on society do not correlate, man, you know how hard I've tried by weighing everything carefully to make them coincide. I'm sore, Jack, good and sore. You imagine me a comic wallowing in a pseudo-tragic drama of seeing the disintegration of my friendships. I don't know whether it's done through your purposefully misunderstanding me or whether some more evil purpose is motivating your actions. I've tried to help you, you turn against me, fearing that my helping you places me in a superior position. Maybe the picture of being misunderstood and lonely, defying all mankind, appeals to you, but it doesn't to me. Thomas Wolfe was at odds with the world, so John Kerouac will be at odds with the world. Do not choose, whatever way is easier. Your letters have been unusually good, but I'd like to see more of your poetry. I haven't been just in this letter. I've only attempted to ward off certain tendencies you have. I had to speak candidly, and it has hurt you, but not as much as it hurt me. Sincerely, Sebastian. And then as a postscript he writes, Comrade, a little poem. Cursed be the windswept stars, and the night be one as thunder. You've had your share of scars. Comrade, we shan't go under. So that's the kind of support that he had from his friends at home.
And that idealism is what drives driving the force.
And the love of literature. Thomas Wolfe was Kerouac's literary model here, was at odds with the world. So John Kerouac, that was his name, will be at odds with the world. Now the letters have this sense of the way I chose the letters, because there were twice as many as I could fit into a book of this size, was to select the ones that didn't duplicate, first of all, because often he was so keen on writing that he wrote 3 and 4 a night and sometimes redid the same stories. But I wanted to select letters that would show you his life, and I wanted to span the most important things in his life, which for Kerouac usually were excitements about traveling, about friendships, or about writing, his writing method, his own sense of discovering himself. And the other letter, which I'd like to read a section from, was written much later when he had found his voice as a writer. This is from 1955, and he was 2 years away from publishing On the Road. He'd written it 4 years before, and the editor, Malcolm Cowley, who was a very important literary person, he'd written books, he'd been friends in the 1920s with Faulkner and Hemingway, and you know, he had actually been compiling about the time that Jack's writing this letter, the portable Faulkner, which helped turn around Faulkner's literary reputation. So Jack has Cowley speaking for him, as he says, to Viking Press, because he's a literary advisor, urging them to take the book and publish it, if Jack will revise. And he's gotten a $200 scholarship for Jack, so that Jack could go to Mexico City. There's no money. Jack is so poor, he can't even afford the postage for Mexico City. I mean, he's got to scrounge every penny. And on September 11th, 1955, he writes Malcolm saying that the money that you've sent me has really paid off. I've written a long short story and a short one and a book of poems, which was Mexico City Blues. He stops after a decent interval, probably like one side of a sheet of paper, and then he's so excited, writing Malcolm Cowley, his editor-to-be at Viking, that there's a postscript again. But this is by Jack Kerouac now. Malcolm, I never did tell you my theory of writing. If it isn't spontaneous, right unto the very sound of the mind, it can only be crafty and revised, by which the paradox arises, we get what a man has hidden, that is, his craft, instead of what we most need, what a man has shown, that is, blown like a jazz musician or a rose. The requirements for prose and verse are the same. Blow. What a man most wishes to hide, revise, and unsay is precisely what literature is waiting and bleeding for. Every doctor knows, every prophet knows the convulsion of truth. Let the writer open his mouth and yap it like Shakespeare and get said what is only irrecoverably said once in time, the way it comes, for time is of the essence. I foresee a new literature on account of this, but it's hard, it's paradoxical. It's taken me all my life to learn to write what I actually think by not thinking. I'm writing my Deloise legend, that was his literary name for himself, as though it were one great dream, and the whole thing, whether in the section of it dealing with dreams of sleep called Book of Dreams, or the section of it dealing with meditation reports, because he was studying Buddhism, or sections of it dealing with adventures, past or present, or to come, the whole Deloise legend is regarded as one great dream with unified, spontaneous language, lulling out the report forever, so that in my sleep bed the uproar continues, and the uproar, like uproar of Finnegan's Wake of Joyce, has no beginning and no end, so that in the end the written Deloise legend is only a tiny fragment of the huge ignorance of consciousness. Excuse me for running along long. Regards to Keith at Viking, Jay.
That's wonderful.
That's a great footnote when he's really just like really rushing with the new method and is so high after having composed Mexico City Blues.
Well, like many writers, he was fascinated by talking about the process of writing and,
yes.
And of course the dreams and all of his experimentation with Eastern religions, trying to get beneath the surface of
That's
things.
right, and into spontaneity, which I think was the true appeal of Buddhism for him. One was that the first dictum is all life is suffering, and waiting so long to get published and to be recognized that his spontaneous prose style was a legitimate way for someone to be writing his complete lifetime. That was suffering. He had few moments of joy before he felt that people were starting to get on his wavelength. His friends always did. I should quickly say that Ginsberg, Burroughs, Snyder, Whalen always appreciated what he was trying to do and took him seriously as a writer. The irony is that when he began to be published, the sensational books were the ones first, like On the Road, and no one reading it thought he was a writer. They all thought that he was, Dean Moriarty, Neil Cassidy, and typed him as such.
Well, and Truman Capote complained that what he's doing, it's not writing, that's typing.
Yeah, I know, and Truman Capote, I think, was jealous. What actually happened, if you study Kerouac, you're aware that he's always writing in little notebooks, which he puts in his breast pocket. He's very rarely the center stage. He'd be acutely uncomfortable with the lights of a television studio. And the times when he is on television, he really is either drunk to get his courage up to do the interview, or he slouches, and he's so clearly uncomfortable that it's hard to watch. Unlike, say, Ginsberg, who can take the media and really use it to his advantage, Kerouac had no real skill or pleasure in it. On the other hand, when he is writing the books, he is presenting a whole other picture of himself, which, not the writer, but somebody who is the innocent, there for the adventure, or the seeker after the truth, the Buddhist search. Or, since he was from birth a Catholic and really believed in a religious perception of what life was like, that we don't only live it on a mundane perspective, but there's a spiritual joy in what we do. He's giving this as the message through his persona, but rarely is he the writer. So you have to get that.
There is that self-destructive element too, the alcoholism, and he died, he was what, 47?
Yes, indeed. He needed alcohol and he needed these stimulants because, unlike what Capote said, it's real hard to write spontaneous prose. Most writers I know, including myself, like to edit their work. And one of the joys of the word processor for me isn't only that you can keep the thought going, but that it's so easy to revise. And Kerouac would have hated that aspect of it. He doesn't really feel that that's first thought, best thought is what Ginsberg says from Kerouac. He's his best student, Ginsberg. On the other hand, Kerouac, in order to get the ecstasy of mind, get the rush, needed, first of all, to be physically very strong, to sit for long periods of time and work through the memories. And secondly, he needed euphoria. He needed the sense to communicate his joy. He needed to take stimulants, different drugs. And finally, the ecstasy of mind wore out his body. And from a very early age, he suffered from thrombophlebitis, too much benzodrine. And he was unable to follow, say, the course of someone like William S. Burroughs into hard narcotics because his body couldn't take it. So his drug of choice was alcohol. And he was an alcoholic, I think, by the time he was, 20, 25.
He also was obviously a very incandescent person to be around, but very difficult. He had, 3 marriages?
Well, I don't think in today's score that's so unusual. In his own time, it was unusual. I think yes, he was. He had no sense that he ever wanted the responsibilities of marriage, which include children. And for me, the great tragedy isn't so much that he didn't ever establish a home of his own. He lived with his mother when he wasn't on the road, or with his friends, but mostly with his mother. The great tragedy is that he had a daughter, Jan Kerouac, and he didn't acknowledge her publicly as his daughter, although in private in the letters he says she looks like me. He didn't want to assume responsibility for her, and so he made her life very difficult by renouncing her. And he never also got the joys of fatherhood, which I think help people grow up.
Was that sense that he wanted to live lightly, travel? I mean, he was on the road, that you couldn't have that baggage.
That's right. That's what he said. But predominantly it was a selfish reason, that he felt that if he had to make a living to support a wife and a child or many children, he wouldn't be able to spend his time writing. And that's all he wanted to do.
You teach writing, you teach the short story to young people. What kinds of things do they bring to Kerouac?
Well, young people now see him, I think, in a very good way, which is as a courage teacher. He's not a secret hero as he was to me when I started my work with him in the 60s, when his books weren't selling very well. To people today reading Kerouac in this very different time in the 1990s, he stands for somebody who had the courage to follow his own voice and to listen to his own voice and not to be trapped in the larger structures that sort of try to program life for you. It's increasingly difficult to be an artist, for example, and to go your own way as an artist. And Kerouac is an example of somebody who held out, who didn't compromise, and who believed that he could do it despite enormous personal costs, the children, the homelessness, lack of money, and so forth, and succeeded because he was a genius. And
he believed in the written word.
He definitely believes in the written word. He wants to create what he calls book movies. Because of the early language being French, he, on some level, never felt that comfortable with English. And so his method, he says, is to look at the picture in the mind, not think of words, but think of picture. So the word in books, he believed in books. And the word in books he called book movies, because by putting it in a book, the reader, he really believed in the reader too, could come into the book and form his or her own pictures reading, as we do when we read, and make her own movie or his own movie.
I'm intrigued that one of the projects you're working on is a CD-ROM.
Well, I'm a consultant for that. There will be shortly, I think in May of 1995, a CD-ROM of the Dharma Bums, which is one of the 3 popular books, which I think is being done magnificently well from what I've seen. And I hope it succeeds, admirably. It's taken a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money, and there are things, music, film clips, background to the books, interviews with people who were part of Kerouac's life, like Kerouac's love, Carolyn Cassidy, Neil Cassidy's widow, is on that CD-ROM. And so it should be, I think it should be very exciting.
He probably would have loved the idea of that seamlessness of being able to switch back and forth from text to visual to sound to music.
Possibly. It is a visual medium, yes, indeed. So
but you also have some books coming out.
Well, Viking is publishing a book of Kerouac's that he prepared before he died. So it was in manuscript, and it's being done exactly as he prepared it, called Book of Blues. And then they're also going to bring out other books that no publisher was venturesome enough in the 1950s to publish, his Buddhist books. He did a Life of the Buddha called Wake Up that has been serialized in Tricycle magazine, a Buddhist magazine. And they're putting out a large book called Some, S-O-M-E, of the Dharma, Some of the Truth, which are his meditations on Buddhist scriptures that he's translated from the French.
Ann Charter, I want to thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Ann Charter has been in the Twin Cities on the road with Jack Kerouac, his book, The Portable Jack Kerouac, and Selected Letters. I'm Steve Benson. Thanks for joining us on a discussion.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.